In the frozen heart of a Wyoming winter, they stripped her bare before the crowd to break her spirit. Then silence fell, and a lone rancher stepped forward, draped a green blanket over her shoulders, and spoke 4 words. "You're coming with me." From that moment, everything changed. The cold was a living thing. It had teeth that bit at the bare skin of my arms, and a hollow voice that whispered through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods. But the cold outside was a pale imitation of the one that had taken root in my bones, a frost blooming from the inside out. It was the cold of absolute shame. The road was not a road, but a track of frozen mud, rutted and hard as iron. The low pewter sky threatened more snow, promising to bury what little dignity I had left under a shroud of white. Around me, the faces of our neighbors in this small, hardscrabble Wyoming valley were a gallery of grim curiosity. They stood huddled in their thick wool coats and worn furs, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their eyes watching my undoing. See Jed's voice, thin and reedy with false bravado, cut through the wind. See what happens when you defy your husband, when you bring shame on his name. He held up my woolen coat, the last bastion of my warmth and modesty, as if it were a trophy. His mother, Martha Barlow, stood beside him, her face a mask of pinched triumph. She was a woman carved from the same unforgiving granite as the mountains that hemmed us in. It was her idea, this public stripping, this ritual of humiliation designed to break me down to my foundation and rebuild me as something more compliant, more theirs. "She's got a prideful heart," that one Martha declared to the assembled watchers, her voice like gravel grating on stone. "Pride must be scoured away before the Lord can find purchase. We are doing the Lord's work." My shift was thin cotton, useless against the wind that sliced through it and raised goose flesh on my skin. The cold was so intense it was a pain, a constant deep ache. But the stares were worse. I saw pity in some, a cruel satisfaction in others, and in most the simple detached interest of people watching a barn fire, a tragedy to be sure, but one that didn't touch them. I fixed my eyes on a distant point where the gray sky met the white ridge, trying to transport myself there to a place of clean, empty numbness. I was a stone. I was a frozen clod of earth. I was nothing. Jed took a step closer, his face flushed with a weak man's power. "Now you'll learn your place, Alara." I flinched not at his words, but at the use of my name. It felt like a violation of branding. In my mind, I was already trying to shed it, to leave it behind with the clothes they had torn from me and cast into the mud. It was then that the silence fell. It wasn't a gradual quieting, but a sudden heavy blanket that smothered the murmurs and the wind itself. A presence had arrived. He came walking down the track, leading a stout bay horse laden with supplies. He wasn't a large man, not in the way Jed's father had been, all beer belly and bluster. This man was built of denser material, of sinew and quiet resolve. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived without waste. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes, when they finally lifted and found mine, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They saw everything and revealed nothing. This was Silas Cole, our neighbor from the high country. A man who kept to himself, whose land bordered the Barlows, but whose world was entirely his own. He was a creature of rumor and solitude. A man people spoke of in low tones in the general store, but whom no one truly knew. He stopped a dozen feet away, his gaze sweeping over the scene, me shivering in my shift. Jed puffed up with his momentary authority. Martha, her lips a thin bloodless line. His expression did not change. He simply took it all in. Jed, feeling his audience and his power slipping, straightened his shoulders. "This is family business, Cole. Best you move on." Silas's eyes moved from Jed and settled back on me. I saw a flicker of something in their gray depths, not pity, which I couldn't have borne, but a kind of stark, unadorned recognition. He saw a thing that was broken and cold. He turned his head slightly, his voice low and carrying no more inflection than the wind, yet it cut through everything. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the frozen ground beneath our feet. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know if this was a rescue or just a different kind of damnation. But as I looked from Jed's sneering face to the absolute stillness of Silas Cole, I knew that any path leading away from here was one I had to take. "She is my wife, Jed," spat, taking a half step forward. "She belongs to me." Silas didn't even look at him. His eyes remained on me, holding me. For the first time, he spoke directly to my soul. "Do you?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. And in the depths of my shame, a tiny frozen ember of defiance glowed. I gave the slightest shake of my head. No, that was all he needed. The world seemed to move in slow, deliberate frames. Silas Cole dropped the lead rope of his horse. The animal stood placidly, its breath fogging in the air. He walked to the side of the horse and unlashed a heavy folded wool blanket from behind the saddle. It was a dark forest green thick with lanolin and the promise of warmth. He walked directly toward me. He didn't hurry, his boots making a steady crunching sound on the frozen earth. The small crowd took a collective step back as if a magnetic field were pushing them away. Jed and Martha stood their ground, their faces a mixture of outrage and a dawning uncertainty. When Silas reached me, he didn't speak. He simply opened the blanket to its full width, the movement releasing a faint, clean scent of pine smoke and cold air. He wrapped it around my shoulders, his hands brushing my arms for only a moment. They were rough, calloused, but there was no judgment in their touch. The weight of the blanket was immediate, a heavy grounding force. The warmth began to seep in a slow, painful tide against the ice in my veins. It was the first kindness I had felt in so long that it hurt more than the cold. I pulled it tighter, hiding my face in the coarse fabric, and finally allowed myself to tremble. With the blanket secured around me, a shield against the eyes of the world, Silas turned. He faced Jed and Martha, and his stillness became something else. It was no longer passive. It was an immovable object. "This is my land you're standing on," he said. His voice was the same low monotone, but it was laced with something ancient and territorial. "The fence line is 50 yards back that way. You're trespassing." Jed scoffed, though the sound was thin, unconvincing. "We have a right. That woman is my—" "Get off my land," Silas repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The command was absolute. It was the voice of a man who drew lines and expected them to be respected, who owned his small piece of the world so completely that his will was law upon it. Martha, ever the serpent, hissed, "You have no right to interfere, Silas Cole. She is a sinner, and we are—" "I don't care what you are," he cut in, his words sharp and final. "I only care what you are doing, and you are doing it on my property. Leave." For a long moment no one moved. The wind whistled a mournful tune through the fence wire. Jed looked at his mother, his resolve crumbling. He had orchestrated this performance for an audience, but he had no script for a confrontation with a man like Silas. Men like Jed relied on the noise of society, on public opinion and shaming. Men like Silas relied only on themselves. It was an unfair fight. Martha's eyes, small and black as beads of jet, narrowed with venom. She shot me a look of pure hatred, a promise of future reckonings. Then with a curt nod to her son, she turned and began the walk back to their property, her back ramrod straight. Jed hesitated, cast one last frustrated look at me, and then scurried after her like a chastened dog. The crowd, sensing the drama was over, began to dissolve, melting back toward the warmth of their own hearths, their own quiet lives, leaving the three of us alone on the frozen road. Silas watched them go, his posture unchanging until they were distant figures against the snow. Only then did he seem to relax the tension leaving his shoulders. He turned back to the horse, picked up the lead rope, and looked at me. "Can you walk?" I nodded, my chin still buried in the life-saving wool. Words felt impossible, a currency I no longer possessed. "The cabin isn't far." He started walking, leading the horse, and I fell into step beside him. We moved away from the scene of my humiliation, heading deeper into the trees, climbing higher into the hills where the snow lay thicker on the ground. The landscape was stark and beautiful in its severity. The dark, jagged lines of the pines against the endless white of the snow, the silence broken only by the crunch of our feet and the soft snort of the horse. The air grew cleaner, sharper, washing away the scent of the crowd. Each step was an effort, my body stiff and aching. But each step also took me further from the Barlows, from that road, from the woman I had been only an hour before. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know the man who walked silently beside me. But he had wrapped me in a warm blanket and faced down my tormentors without a single wasted word. For now, in the heart of that unforgiving winter, it was more than enough. It was everything. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing protected by a stand of old-growth spruce that stood like silent sentinels, their boughs heavy with snow. It was not a large home, but it looked as if it had grown from the earth itself, built of dark, heavy logs chinked neatly against the cold. A plume of gray smoke rose arrow-straight from a stone chimney, a welcome sign of life and warmth in the frozen wilderness. A split-rail fence enclosed a small yard, and a sturdy-looking barn stood a little ways off. It was a place of solitude and purpose. Silas led the horse toward the barn, pausing at the cabin door. "Go inside," he said, his gaze directed toward the latch. "The fire is banked." I hesitated. To cross the threshold of another person's home, especially in my state, felt like a monumental transgression. I was a stray bringing my dirt and my sorrow into this clean, quiet place. He must have sensed my reluctance. "Go on," he said, his voice a little softer this time. "You'll freeze standing out here." I did as he said, my numb fingers fumbling with the iron latch. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges and I stepped inside. The warmth hit me first, a dry, enveloping heat from a large stone hearth that dominated one wall. A bed of glowing orange coals pulsed at its heart. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, the faint, clean scent of shaved cedar. The cabin consisted of a single large room. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Along one wall were shelves filled with neatly stacked tins and jars, a testament to a well-stocked larder. A simple iron-framed bed covered with a patchwork quilt occupied a far corner. Everything was Spartan, functional, and immaculately clean. There were no decorations, no photographs, no clutter. It was the home of a man who needed little and wasted nothing. It was a house of silence. I stood there, a strange, pathetic creature in my thin shift, and his borrowed blanket feeling utterly out of place. I heard Silas outside, his movements efficient as he tended to his horse. I knew I should do something, but my mind was a frozen fog. So I just stood by the fire, letting the heat slowly, painfully, bring my frozen limbs back to life. When he finally came in, stamping the snow from his boots, he didn't seem surprised to find me in the exact same spot. He shed his heavy coat, hanging it on a peg by the door, and went to the hearth. He added 2 split logs to the coals, which soon caught and began to crackle, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He still hadn't really looked at me. His actions were all practical, focused on the necessities of life in winter fire shelter. He moved to a small cast-iron stove in the corner, filled a kettle with water from a bucket, and set it on to boil. "There's a room through there," he said, nodding toward a simple plank door I hadn't noticed before. "You can use it. There are clothes on the bed. They were my mother's. They'll be too big, but they're warm." He said it all without looking at me, his attention on measuring coffee grounds into a percolator. His detachment was a strange kind of gift. He wasn't ignoring me out of cruelty, but out of a deep instinctual respect for my pain. He was giving me space, an ocean of it, in which my ragged emotions could settle without being prodded or questioned. I found the door and slipped into the small adjoining room. It was little more than a space for a bed and a small wooden chest. And as he'd said, laid out on the bed was a set of clothes. A heavy wool skirt, a flannel shirt, thick stockings, and undergarments. They were clean and smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. I touched the fabric of the shirt. It was worn soft with countless washings. I imagined the woman who had worn it, his mother, and a wave of such profound sorrow washed over me that my knees felt weak. I was an imposter, a ghost haunting the clothes of another better woman. Slowly, painfully, I stripped off my dirt-stained shift, the last remnant of my life with the Barlows, and washed myself as best I could with a basin of icy water I found on a stand. The cold was a shock, but it was a clean pain, one that felt like a purification. Dressing in the borrowed clothes, I felt swallowed by them, but also armored. The wool was thick and protective. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was warm. When I came back out, a steaming mug of coffee was waiting on the table. Silas was sitting in the other chair, his back to me, staring into the fire. I sat down, my movements stiff and uncertain. The silence stretched on, filled only by the crackling of the logs and the soft whistle of the wind outside. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It was a peaceful silence, a healing one. With the Barlows, silence had been a weapon. It was the prelude to an accusation, the tense space in which my flaws were being counted and judged. But here the silence was a refuge. It was a wide-open country where I could simply be. It asked nothing of me. I wrapped my hands around the hot mug, the ceramic warming my fingers. I watched Silas's back. He was a wall between me and the world that had hurt me. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't ask what had happened, though he had seen the worst of it. He didn't ask what I would do now. He simply provided the most fundamental things: fire shelter and a quiet space to mend. The silence he offered was a sanctuary, I realized. A fallow ground where the seeds of a new life, however small and uncertain, might have a chance to grow. For days, this was our routine. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake me. I would hear the scrape of his shovel as he cleared a path to the barn, the rhythmic chunk of his axe splitting firewood. I would rise later and find the fire roaring and coffee made. He would be gone for hours tending to his traps or hunting, and I would have the cabin to myself. I did small things at first, washed our mugs, swept the floor, tidied the shelves. They were small acts of existence, proofs that I was still alive. He never commented on them. He never thanked me. He would just come in, his face ruddy from the cold, and nod a silent greeting. We would eat our meals in that same companionable silence. He was a man who seemed to have no need for words, and I was a woman who had lost her faith in them. It was a perfect, unspoken contract. In the house of silence, I began slowly and painstakingly to piece myself back together. A week passed in this quiet rhythm, a timeless expanse of snow and silence. The sharp edges of my trauma were beginning to soften, the constant humming fear in my belly receding to a dull ache. I started to believe I might be safe. But the past is a hungry wolf. It will always track you down. I was by the cabin's single window, watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes when I saw them. Two figures far off on the ridge that marked the edge of Silas's property. Even from this distance, I knew their shapes. The hulking, stooped shoulders of Jed and the smaller, rigid form of his mother. They were just standing there, dark shapes against the white, watching the cabin. They made no move to come closer, but they didn't have to. Their presence alone was a violation, a poison seeping back into my sanctuary. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over me. My breath hitched, and the room, which had felt so safe moments before, suddenly felt fragile, exposed. They were waiting. Like vultures, they were just waiting for Silas to leave, for me to be alone and vulnerable. The quiet life I had started to build here was a house of cards, and the Barlows were the wind. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, starting at every creak of the logs, every sigh of the wind. The silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was filled with my own fear. Silas returned at dusk, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He came in and found me sitting by the fire, my hands clenched in my lap, the untouched mending I'd been working on lying forgotten beside me. He must have seen the change in me immediately. My carefully constructed composure had shattered. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply hung up his coat, took his hunting knife from its sheath, and moved to the table to skin the rabbits. His movements were as precise and unhurried as always. But as the lamplight flickered, I saw him glance towards the window in the direction of the ridge. He knew. Perhaps he'd seen their tracks in the snow, or perhaps he could simply read the fear on me as easily as he read the weather in the sky. Later that evening, after our silent meal, he did something different. Instead of sitting by the fire or retiring to his bed, he took his long rifle down from the pegs where it rested above the hearth. He brought it to the table, and by the soft golden light of the oil lamp, he began to clean it. He laid out a small leather roll containing his tools. Rods, patches of cloth, a small can of oil. My fear spiked. Was he expecting them to come? Was he preparing for violence? I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as he worked. His hands, which I had only seen perform practical tasks like chopping wood or tending a fire, moved with an intimate and unsettling grace. He disassembled the weapon with practiced ease, his fingers seeming to know every screw and pin by heart. He didn't say a word. The only sounds were the soft shh of the cleaning rod sliding down the barrel, and the faint click of metal on metal as he wiped each component clean. The smell of gun oil, sharp and metallic, filled the small cabin. He wasn't doing it in an aggressive or threatening way. His expression was calm, his focus absolute. And as I watched him, a strange thing happened. My fear began to subside, replaced by a complex and unfamiliar feeling. His actions were not a threat. They were a message. The methodical, deliberate act of cleaning that rifle was a statement spoken in the silent language we shared. It said, "I am aware of the danger. I am not afraid. I am prepared." The rifle, a tool of potential violence, became in his hands a symbol of protection. He was quietly, unflinchingly reinforcing the walls of the sanctuary he had built around me. He was telling the shadows outside, and the fear inside me, that this ground would be defended. He never looked at me as he worked, but I knew that every calm, measured movement was for my benefit. It was the most eloquent speech I had ever heard. When he was finished, he reassembled the rifle, the final click of the bolt, seating home sounding loud in the quiet room. He ran a hand over the smooth wood of the stock, then rose and placed it back on its pegs above the hearth. He looked at me then, his gray eyes meeting mine across the room. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my soul that I was not alone. The weather turned that night. The wind rose from a mournful whisper to a furious howl, rattling the window pane and driving snow against the cabin walls with a sound like handfuls of thrown sand. A full-blown blizzard descended from the mountains, erasing the world outside our small fortress of warmth and light. The cabin groaned under the assault, the logs shifting as if the storm were a great beast trying to claw its way in. In the midst of the tempest, sometime after midnight, a new sound pierced the din. It was a faint, distressed bleating, carried on the wind from the direction of the barn. Silas was out of his bed in an instant, pulling on his boots and heavy coat. "One of the ewes," he said, his voice tight with concern. "She's due, and she's in trouble." He grabbed a heavy lantern from a hook and lit the wick. The flame sputtered, then caught, casting long dancing shadows. "Stay here," he ordered, his hand on the door latch. But I was already on my feet, pulling on the boots and coat he had provided for me. The thought of staying alone in the cabin while he faced the storm and a crisis was unbearable. More than that, an instinct I didn't know I possessed rose up in me. I had been a passive recipient of his charity for too long. "I can help," I said, my own voice surprising me with its firmness. He looked at me for a long moment, his face illuminated by the lantern light. I saw a flicker of protest in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a quiet acceptance. He simply nodded, pushed the door open, and we stepped out into the roaring chaos. The force of the wind was staggering. It stole the breath from my lungs and drove stinging ice crystals into my face. The snow was already knee-deep, and the air was a blinding, swirling vortex of white. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I followed in Silas's wake, clutching the back of his coat as he broke a trail toward the barn, a dark shape against the maelstrom. Inside the barn was a pocket of relative calm, the howl of the wind muffled by the thick walls. The air was warm and smelled of hay, animals, and fear. In a small pen, a ewe lay on her side, her breathing ragged, her sides heaving with effort. She was straining, but it was clear something was wrong. "The lamb's turned," Silas said, stripping off his coat and rolling up his sleeves in the frigid air. His breath plumed around him. "It's a breach. If I can't turn it, we'll lose them both." He handed me the lantern. "Hold this. Keep it steady and keep it close." I knelt in the hay beside him, my hands trembling as I held the lantern aloft. The pool of golden light cut through the gloom, illuminating the life and death struggle in the small pen. Silas murmured softly to the ewe, his voice a low, calming rumble. He gentled her with his hands, then with a deep breath he reached inside to help. The next hour was a blur of intense, focused effort. The barn was our entire world, the storm a distant, roaring sea. My one job was to hold the light steady, to be his eyes. I watched his face etched with concentration, his jaw tight. I watched his arms' muscles straining with the delicate, difficult work. He was completely absorbed, his entire being focused on the task of saving these two lives. I wasn't just a bystander. My light was essential. We were a team working in tandem. In the shared, focused intimacy of the moment, the walls I had so carefully built around myself began to crumble. I was no longer Ilara, the victim, the shamed wife. I was a woman holding a light in a storm, a partner in a fight for life. Finally, with a great effort from both Silas and the ewe, a tiny, impossibly fragile lamb, slick and steaming, slid out into Silas's waiting hands. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't move. Silas worked quickly, clearing its airway and rubbing it vigorously with a piece of burlap. Then it gave a weak shudder, let out a tiny, quavering bleat, and kicked its spindly legs. "Life." Silas laid the lamb beside its mother, who immediately began to lick it clean, her own exhaustion forgotten. He sank back on his heels, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He was covered in sweat despite the cold, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes shone with a quiet, profound satisfaction. He looked over at me, his gaze meeting mine in the warm lantern light. The noise of the storm, the cold, the past, it all fell away. There was only this small, sacred space we had carved out together. A word rose in my throat, a simple, inadequate word for the immensity of what I felt. "Thank you," I whispered. It wasn't for saving me from the Barlows. It wasn't for the shelter or the food. It was for this. For letting me be a part of something, for trusting me to hold the light. Silas held my gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the same gesture he always used, but this time it felt different. It was weighted with shared experience, with the unspoken bond forged between two people who had faced down the darkness together and brought forth a new life. We returned to the cabin side by side against the wind, no longer a protector and a refugee, but two souls weathering the same storm. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning us in the cabin, but it was no longer a prison. After the birth of the lamb, the very air between us had shifted. The silence was still there, but it was now imbued with a new quality. A shared understanding that needed no words. The cabin felt smaller, warmer, more like a home. With the world outside buried in white, I turned my attention inward. I could not plant a garden in the frozen earth, but I could cultivate the space we lived in. I found a mending basket in his mother's chest filled with spools of thread and worn needles. I began to repair Silas's work shirts, stitching up small tears and reinforcing frayed cuffs. My fingers, clumsy at first, slowly regained their old nimbleness. Each small, even stitch was an act of meditation, a way of mending the tears in my own spirit. One afternoon, while searching for more mending supplies, I found a small wooden box tucked away at the bottom of the chest. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs, were several packets of seeds, their corners worn and soft with age. There were beans, squash, and zinnias, their names written in a delicate, faded script on the paper packets. A ghost of a garden, a promise of spring. I laid them out on the table, a colorful mosaic of hope against the dark wood. Planting a garden in the dead of winter was a defiant act of faith, a quiet declaration that I believed in a future and a season beyond the snow. Silas came in from shoveling snow and saw the seed packets arranged on the table. He stopped, his gaze lingering on them. I held my breath, worried I had overstepped, that I had disturbed a memory best left untouched. He walked over, picked up a packet of morning glory seeds, and turned it over in his calloused fingers. "My mother," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "She believed you could fix anything with a garden." He placed the packet back down gently, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. In them I saw not resentment, but a shared flicker of memory and loss. He was letting me in just a little into the quiet, guarded spaces of his past. That evening I felt a new confidence stirring. I found a small tin of dried mint leaves in the pantry. I boiled water and steeped the leaves, the fragrant, clean scent filling the cabin. I poured the tea into 2 mugs, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, I placed one on the table beside him where he sat cleaning a piece of harness leather. It was a simple offering, but it felt momentous. It was the first thing I had created for him, for us, that wasn't a chore or a necessity. It was a gesture of companionship. He stopped his work and looked at the steaming mug. He looked at me. Then he picked it up, blew gently on the surface, and took a sip. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He simply set the mug down and gave me his customary nod. But this nod was different. It was not the nod of a landlord to a tenant, or a protector to a ward. It was the nod of a partner. It was an acceptance not just of the tea, but of me, of my presence in his home, in his life. Our story was no longer about rescue. It was slowly, quietly becoming a story about cohabitation. I was putting down roots in the frozen ground of his solitary life, and to my astonishment, he was not pulling them up. We were 2 solitary trees, our branches battered by our own private storms, who now found ourselves growing in the same small, sheltered clearing, our roots beginning to tentatively intertwine in the silent earth beneath the snow. The thaw came a week later, a false spring that brought melting snow and a treacherous, slick mud. And with the thaw, the wolves returned. I was outside hanging a blanket over the fence to air in the crisp sunshine when I heard the sound of their horses. Jed and his mother appeared at the edge of the clearing, their faces grim. Jed was holding a bottle, and from the way he swayed in the saddle, it was clear it wasn't his first. Martha's face was harder than ever, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. My blood ran cold. I dropped the blanket and backed slowly toward the cabin door. Silas was inside, sharpening his axe on a whetstone. "Silas," I called out, my voice thin and tight. He appeared at the door instantly, the whetstone still in one hand. He took in the scene, his face becoming a stony mask. He placed the stone on the porch rail and stepped out in front of me, positioning himself between me and the Barlows. He stood there unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, a bulwark of pure, immovable will. "You've come far enough, Barlow," Silas said, his voice flat and even. "I've come for what's mine," Jed slurred, swinging a leg over his horse and stumbling as he landed. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "My wife. The law says she's my wife." "The law doesn't live up here," Silas replied, his eyes never leaving Jed's. "Only people, and she's not a thing you own." That one sentence struck me with the force of a physical blow. She's not a thing you own. In all my years with Jed, in all the sermons I had heard about a wife's duty, no one had ever suggested such a radical, beautiful idea. "You've poisoned her mind against me." And God, Martha shrieked from her horse. "She is a fornicator, an adulteress hiding here in your den of sin." Jed, emboldened by his mother's venom, took a swaggering step forward. "I'm taking her home. We'll beat this devil out of her." He lunged for me. It happened so fast. Silas didn't move with anger, but with a kind of brutal efficiency like a force of nature. He stepped into Jed's path, his body absorbing the clumsy charge. He didn't throw a punch. He simply used Jed's momentum against him, grabbing his collar and arm and throwing him to the ground. Jed landed with a heavy, muddy thud, the air rushing out of him. He lay there gasping like a landed fish, his drunken courage evaporating into the cold air. Silas stood over him not with triumph, but with a kind of weary disdain. "She is not going anywhere," Silas said, each word a stone dropping into a deep well. "This is her home now. If you ever set foot on this land again, I will not be so gentle." Jed scrambled backward in the mud, his face a mask of fear and humiliation. He looked up at his mother for help, but she was staring at Silas, her face contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost sublime. She had met an obstacle her malice could not overcome. As if on cue, the sky, which had been bright moments before, turned a dark bruised purple. The temperature dropped and a sudden violent squall of freezing rain swept down from the peaks. It wasn't snow, but a hard cleansing downpour that instantly turned the ground to a slurry of mud and ice. It hammered down on us, washing the world clean. It plastered Jed's hair to his skull and soaked Martha's severe dress, making her look small and defeated. Without another word, she wrenched her horse's head around and galloped away. Jed, slipping and sliding in the mud, scrambled back onto his own horse and chased after her, a pathetic broken figure swallowed by the storm. I stood there on the porch, trembling, the icy rain soaking my clothes. Silas turned to me, his face unreadable. The storm raged around us, a violent, chaotic symphony. But in the center of it, in the space between us, there was a profound and unshakable calm. The past had come for me, and this quiet, solitary man had faced it down without fanfare, without anger. Just a simple, powerful declaration of my own humanity. He had called this place my home, and as the cold rain washed over me, I realized it was true. This small cabin, this patch of unforgiving land, this quiet man, they were my home. The storm wasn't an ending. It was a baptism. In the days following the confrontation, a new peace settled over the cabin, deeper and more enduring than before. The final threat had been met and vanquished. The ghosts were gone. One afternoon, while cleaning out a dusty corner of the pantry, my hand brushed against something hard. It was a small porcelain teacup, broken into several pieces, wrapped carefully in an old cloth. It was beautiful, delicately painted with tiny blue forget-me-nots. It felt like a relic of a more fragile, elegant time. A relic of his mother. I took the pieces to the table and laid them out. I thought of my own life shattered into pieces on that frozen road. I thought of how Silas had not tried to magically fix me, but had simply given me a safe, quiet space to gather my own fragments. We had no glue, but I found a small pot of pine pitch Silas used for sealing and repairs. I heated it carefully over the fire until it was soft and malleable. Then with painstaking patience, I began to mend the cup. I fitted the pieces together one by one, sealing the cracks with the dark golden pitch. My hands didn't shake. My purpose was clear. It was not a perfect repair. The dark lines of the pitch were clearly visible, mapping the history of the cup's breaking. It would never be what it once was, but it was whole again. The lines didn't speak of weakness, but of resilience. They told a story. I was finishing the last seam when Silas came in. He stopped and watched me, his eyes on my hands on the mended cup. I filled it with water from the bucket and it held. Not a single drop leaked. I looked up at him, a silent offering of my work, and then I saw it. It started in his eyes, a warmth that spread like the dawn. It softened the hard lines of his face and pulled at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since I had met him, Silas Cole smiled. It was not a wide, beaming grin. It was a small, quiet, profound thing, a crack in his stoic facade that let a whole world of light pour through. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. That smile was an acceptance of all the broken, mended things, the cup, me, and perhaps even himself. "The cracks don't disappear," a voice in my head whispered, "but they tell the story of the strength it took to stand up after the fall." The next morning, we stood together on the small porch. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and glistening under a newborn Sunday. The air was cold and sharp, filled with the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. A new season was coming. He reached out and for the first time took my hand. His fingers were rough and warm, and they closed around mine with a gentle strength that felt like an anchor. We didn't speak. We simply stood there side by side, watching the sun climb over the white-capped peaks, illuminating a world that felt brand new. I was no longer a refugee. This was not just a shelter. This was our home, a place we had built, not with timber and nails, but with silence, with shared moments, with a handful of brave words, and with a quiet, unyielding kindness that had thawed the winter in my soul. Even in the harshest land, I thought my hand held firmly in his, a person can find a refuge. Not in a place, but in a person, in each other. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.